Good morning, colleagues. I hope you can all hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning for session 7.1, Advancing Applied Migration Research Through Collaboration. My name is Nicholas Bishop. I'm the head of Climate Resilience and Security at the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today to moderate this discussion. Let me first begin by acknowledging and sincerely thanking our hosts and partners, the Global Center for Climate Mobility, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and of course, Western Michigan University, for organizing this important three-day symposium. We feel that this event is providing a valuable space for practitioners, policymakers, and researchers to share good practices, to strengthen their networks, and advance advocacy in support of climate migrants. Across the past few days, I think that the symposium has been successful in exploring a range of topics from planned migration, urban inclusion to housing, water, security, livelihoods, and youth engagement. And today's session will continue that conversation by focusing on how applied migration research, regional collaboration, and capacity development can strengthen institutional responses to climate-related mobility. The panel today is organized within the framework of IOM's Climate Change and Migration Data Program, through which IOM is collaborating closely with the Climate Mobility Africa Research Network, or CMARN. Together, these initiatives are advancing evidence generation, mentoring early career researchers in the Global South, and linking academic findings to practical policy tools. As a part of IOM's broader commitment to coherence and adaptive management across our global programming, the CCMD program helps ensure that data and knowledge products are not standalone outputs, but part of a strategic long-term effort to inform national, regional, and global policy responses. So our three speakers today will illustrate how collaboration between international organizations, research networks, and universities can generate actionable evidence that is needed to make climate mobility responses more inclusive, just, and context sensitive. Each speaker is going to present for roughly 15 minutes, after which we'll have around 30 minutes for questions and discussion. And please note your questions as we go, and we'll make sure to open the floor after the presentations. So without further ado, we have three excellent speakers with us today, each bringing a unique perspective on how research can bridge policy and practice. Our first speaker is Dr. Pablo Rojas Copari, who is Senior Research Officer at IOM, where he leads IOM's research unit. Pablo has over 15 years of experience spanning academia, civil society, government administration, and international organizations. His work focuses on migration and asylum policy, governance, and applied research, with particular expertise in labor rights, gender, and development. Today, Pablo is going to introduce IOM's contribution to applied migration research, including its work, as I mentioned, on climate mobility under the CCMD program. He will highlight how collaborative research mentoring and partnerships such as those with CMARN are improving research ethics, data quality, and the practical use of evidence in migration governance. Pablo, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. I hope you're all hearing me well. I'm going to try to share my screen as we start. Oop. And we should be good to go. I believe everything is okay and you can see me and hear me. So
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. Just like my colleague Nick just said, I want to start by thanking the organizers of this symposium and for extending the invitation to IOM to organize this panel. This is a very valuable opportunity for us to highlight the work that we do, both in the research unit, but as a collaboration with CMARN in the climate change and climate mobility side of the house. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here because I'm not a climate migration expert. So my presentation today will really focus on the work that we do in terms of support to applied migration research and early career researchers in IOM, and highlight the CCMD program, of which we are the research unit is one of the technical co-leads. and then present a little bit about our collaboration with Simmer. I'm not going to get too much into detail about the Climate Mobility Africa Research Network because we have two experts from the network who are then going to be able to better introduce not only the context of the network itself, but as well as the products that they are delivering in and outside of the collaboration with IOM. So let me begin. Oh, oh, sorry. There we go. So, by means of introduction, not so sure everyone here is familiar with the International Organization for Migration, but we are the United Nations Migration Agency, and our key mission is to promote safe, orderly, and regular migration that benefits both migrants and societies. We are the leading international organization working on migration, and then we work on an array of issues in terms of addressing operational challenges of migration management, but also to advance evidence-based understanding of migration issues, to encourage social economic development through migration, and to uphold human rights, dignity, and well-being of migrants. It's precisely on the second point to advance evidence-based understanding of migration issues that our work around research and policy focuses on. And it's from that perspective that I'll be speaking to you today. Here on the side, you can see some of the main areas of programming, which will lead you to understand that our organization works on pretty much all aspects related to migration. So one of those aspects is migration policy and research. And in the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about how research informs our programming and our policy making. I work in the research unit, which is based in IOM's headquarters in Geneva, part of the newly established Department of Data, Insight and Policy within the Migration Data and Displacement Research Analytics Division. The research unit has a role to coordinate the production of research and support the production of research in the organization, but migration research actually happens at very different levels across the organization. For context, we are an organization with close to 14,000 staff across 170 countries. And many of our colleagues are working also on data collection directly through operations on the field, but as well we have colleagues working as analysts and producing migration research in the field. On the side of the research unit, we very often take part in research projects that we manage. Those can be at the global level or the regional level. We can lead those ourselves, or we can participate in research advisory boards and so on, where we would then provide an input or priorities coming from our perspective. We also publish migration research ourselves. We are well known for the World Migration Report, which is a series of publications considered one of the global reference report on migration. But aside from that, we also produce yearly a number of publications on migration, on different aspects of migration, which can be found through our publications platform. But we also run a number of different journals, including the Migration Policy Practice, which is IOM established policy-oriented research journal. Aside from that, then we also, as I said, work on different committees and boards and advise on specific research projects. But overall, we see our IOM's mission to be an advocate for migration research, particularly as we identify evidence as a key for policymaking. On the side, you can see how we approach research collaboration in the organization. So our aim is to work with researchers across the board at different aspects in terms of consultancies for IOM, but also jointly collaborating in research projects and jointly producing outputs. But as well guiding and informing the work that the organization does. We try to create genuine collaboration, and by that is sort of the work that we'll be speaking of today, trying to establish long-term partnerships and drawing the strength of partners, but also to create representation across the production of research. So particularly focusing on work with researchers in the Global South, but also with early career researchers that bring new perspective to migration studies. And finally, I think it's very timely to discuss the issue of resources. Um, we generally struggle in terms of producing high quality research outputs in on a time frame that is much shorter than what we could be expected from in the academic world, for example. So we have to manage resources in a different way to prioritize skills and to ensure that the products that we publish can be of use to a range of stakeholders, from policymakers to education to educators and the general public. So that's why we emphasize on the production of what we call applied research, so that informs decision making. So again, just here I mentioned the support to Global South researchers being one of our priorities. We do that through both collaboration and mentoring. So across all the different publications that we produce and support, we um, we strive to have representation of the global South researchers. So, for example, the World Migration Report is co-edited with academics for every edition, and we have identified academics in the Global South. For example, currently the co-editor is based in the University of Lanús in Buenos Aires. The previous one was Linda Ucho from the Africa Migration Research Center in Nairobi. And across our different publications, be it Migration Policy Practice and the International Migration, which is also not led by IOM, but financially supported by it, we contribute to representation and opportunities for Global South researchers to publish. Aside from that, we try to create strategic partnerships where we connect researchers to network and resources and policy platforms, of which CMARN is one example. Aside from that, we've also developed the IOM's Research Partners Panel, which is a database and a network of researchers that generally are made available, that we create opportunities for them to consult and participate in research collaboration with IOM. And the other aspect of work on applied research is capacity building of early career researchers. So currently we are, I'm briefly going to mention this, we're leading a project that's being implemented across Angola, Moldova, Nepal, and Peru. This is based on developing capacities of early career researchers to produce a certain number of applied research papers on policy priorities identified by governments, which will then lead into policy engagement at a national level in those particular countries. The project has just started a month ago, so we're really excited about that, as this is a new venture for us to start working on this aspect. So the next, talking about the climate change and migration data program under which, in the context under which the collaboration with CMARN take place. This is a 31 months program running until the end of 2026, being implemented in 15 countries across 3 regions in Africa. So West, Central, North, and East Africa. You can see in the map the countries that are part of the program. It's funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. And it consists of 2 work streams, one on climate change and human mobility, and another one on migration data and research. Now, the specificity of our work with CMARN and collaboration with CMARN is that it actually cuts across both work streams. So that's it's sort of one of the aims of the program, is that by the end of its implementation, we'll be able to create more synergies across both pillars. And actually, the work that we've been doing with CMARN shows very much the progress on that end. Just to focus on the priorities on for our pillar of migration data and research. One is to increase knowledge, expertise, and capacity to collect, analyze, and utilize migration data, and access to good standards of migration research and data support to evidence-based migration policy development. So our collaboration with CIMERN, again, is expected to deliver on both outcomes, particularly by in producing research that will be able to inform policymakers on the in the climate mobility policy area. Just a few more points on the data and research side of the program. So it's aiming to integrate human mobility and global climate policies to support international migration and climate commitments across the three regions, to advance regional policy frameworks on migration and climate change, to strengthen community resilience to climate change, including through direct field interventions, strengthening youth leadership continentally on aspects related to migration, environment, and climate change, to generate migration, particularly through roots-based research and analysis in North, East, West, Central, and Southern Africa, focusing on pastoral mobility and looking at local climate vulnerability analysis and planning in human mobility impacted in communities in a range of different countries across the three regions. We also support regional data capacity, including those of regional economic commissions in the three regions where we work. Finally, to just very briefly present the collaboration between IOM and CIMERN. As I said, I'm not going to speak a lot about CIMERN because the colleagues coming after me are best placed to do that. I just wanted to introduce maybe the background. So the collaboration between IOM and CIMERN dates from 2021. And so the CCMD program is one iteration of this collaboration. And the aim has been to support a continental initiative to advance research and policy on disaster and climate change displacement in Africa, which then led to a number of academic workshop series, which then led to the creation of the Climate Mobility African Research Network, a platform for exchange among researchers and policymakers working on the topics. So in 2026, so I mean, as part of CCMD, but next year we are aiming to produce a number of different research papers that will take shape in the form of a specific collaborative publication. And that will be readily available both through CIMER networks as well as IOM publications. So this will be peer-reviewed articles that will come out towards the end of 2026. I just have a summary of CIMER, but maybe my colleagues will talk about that a bit more. But there is this is the structure of CIMER. It represents institutions across Africa. It's guided by a steering group of leading researchers and who are expert on the topic. Aims to build knowledge and capacity across researchers in Africa, including early career researchers, fostering collaboration between researchers and policy experts to support evidence-based law and policy development and implementation, and to promote independent research on legal and policy responses to climate disaster related human mobility in Africa. So as you can see, both CIMER and IOM's research perspectives are very closely aligned, particularly as it relates into creating spaces for collaboration between researchers and policymakers, as well as supporting the emergence of early career researchers in this area. So I'm gonna pass on that. So here is talking about just a brief summary of the publications that CIMERN produced, which are the Climate Mobility Africa Insights. So the next issue, this special issue that will be done, will be sort of building upon the policy brief production that CIMER regularly does, but this time it will be done in conjunction with IOM for a special issue that will come out in the third quarter of next year. Thank you, and I think we'll have time for some questions and answers afterwards.
Many thanks, Pablo. Much appreciated for your presentation. Sorry, maybe we can then proceed with our second speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Schraven. Benjamin is from the German Institute for Development and Sustainability. Our next presentation brings a continental perspective on climate mobility. As I mentioned, Dr. Benjamin Schraver, Senior Associate Fellow at the German Institute for Development and Sustainability. Dr. Schraven holds a PhD in development studies from the University of Bonn, and his research focuses on human mobility in the context of climate change, particularly across Africa. He has led commissioned research and consultancy work for the European Union, the World Bank, as well as IOM, among others, and has been a guest lecturer at the University of Ghana. Today, he will present continental perspectives on climate mobility, data, trends, and regional cooperation developed jointly with the Climate Mobility Africa Research Network, CMARN, as we've been discussing. The presentation explores regional data initiatives and cooperation frameworks, including those of the African Union, ECOWAS, IGAD, and SADC, and how these can help harmonize evidence and policy responses to climate-related mobility. Benjamin, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Nicholas, for the kind introduction. I hope you can all see my presentation in presentation mode. Nicholas, if you would be so kind just to nod if that is the case.
Yes, we can see it and we can hear it clearly.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so first of all, you might wonder why now a person is representing CMAN with a presentation on continental perspectives on climate mobility, focusing on data trends and regional cooperation. So why a person who apparently is not African is representing CMAN. CMAN, as Pablo already has mentioned, is a network that is trying to make African voices in the whole climate change, disasters, and new mobility debate and the nexus debate more heard. And it's also really meant for African scholars and fostering the whole science and policy dialogue focusing on Africa. But we are also a couple of non-Africans in the steering group. We are not members of CIMA, but we are supporters. So we are kind of humble servants, also trying to push the CIMA agenda in the second row. So that is why you see me now talking about this topic of data transregional cooperation on behalf of CIMA. So I'm also a member of this steering group. So now, why continental perspective? Why does it matter? Well, if you're looking at the interlinkages between climate change, disasters, and new mobility in Africa, but also mobility patterns in Africa as such, it's quite often cross-border mobility we are talking about. That has many reasons. First of all, there are a lot of shared ecosystems in the African continent that span across many, many countries. Examples include the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes region, and all the different coastal zones. And we can also see that there are now a couple of regional approaches and frameworks that address mobility beyond national borders. However, data and governance in that regard remain rather fragmented across countries and also to some degree across regions. Looking at data gaps and emerging trends, we can see that there is still rather limited systematic data collection efforts when it comes to climate mobility, though there has been a lot of progress looking at IOM's DTM, the disaster tracking metrics, for instance, and other initiatives. However, we still have a high reliance on, let's call them proxy indicators, such as internal displacement, when displacement situations and displacement contexts have rather been hybrid. And so we definitely have the need, for instance, to improve on hazard tagging. Was it related to drought? Was it related to floods? What about the conflict dimensions in there? So, and also about issues of the interconnectivity of data systems is still something where a lot of progress is needed, not only in Africa, but I think that definitely also reflects the global situation. When it comes to trends, we see that there is increasing mobility, in particular in slow onset context. For example, due to coastal erosion in wide parts of the African continent. And we can also see that there is definitely something that I would call a co-trend or co-trends of urbanization and climate change. Climate change is affecting rural-urban migration to some degree, but I mean also when people move to the cities and they live in cities, most likely in informal settlements, they're also affected heavily by the impacts of climate change. Pluvial floodings, for instance, is a recent issue, is a recurring issue that shows that we definitely have the double effects of climate change and urbanization, because also urban infrastructures cannot hold pace with the sometimes really growing population growth. In particular, in medium scale, also smaller cities, which meanwhile are kind of the spotlight of this double trend. Now, just some snapshots on the specific geographies of the African continent when it comes to climate change-related mobility. Looking at the Sahel traditionally, but also in recent years, we can see a lot of adaptive migration. We see a lot of disruption of climate change, disruption of transhumance, of pastoralism due to the effects of climate change, loss of pastures, water spots, etc. That meets, in particular in the Sahel, but also when we're looking at West Africa, to an old established culture of migration, where migration has ever been part of people's lives, of people's life cycles. But of course, also looking at the Sahel, we see a growing impact of all the conflicts going on in that region. On of Africa, we kind of also have a hybrid of both disaster and conflict-related displacements, also across borders between Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, looking at the wider region, looking at Sudan, looking at South Sudan. In Southern Africa, we see that water scarcity, cyclones, again, in particular, since 2019, 2020, have had devastating impacts in several countries. And we have an ongoing trend of labor migration, in particular towards South Africa. Then looking at West Africa's coast, we see that increasingly coastal erosion due to sea level rise is also shaping coastal relocation processes. As I said, that was just the attempt to present a very brief snapshot. You will see a lot more trends in there, but as I said, that was just the attempt to provide a brief snapshot of this geography. And we can also see that there are continental frameworks and a growing, evolving policy architecture when it comes to human mobility. Just to mention a few, we have the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy. And then, of course, the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment, and Climate Change. Then the RECs, the regional economic communities, have definitely developed to become key platforms for policy harmonization, in particular ECOWAS, IGAD, but also SADC. So we can all in all say that we definitely have a momentum towards cross-regional policy convergence when it comes to mobility, but also when it comes to climate change-related human mobility. Just a deeper dive into regional frameworks and initiatives. So IGAD has established the Free Movement Protocol that also includes environmental mobility. ECOWAS has its old established Free Movement Protocol. but also its regional disaster risk reduction strategy is trying to integrate mobility. SADC is actively trying to link climate change adaptation with labor migration frameworks. And also the African Union, IOM, have the joint program, New Mobility in the context of climate change. So also here we can see there is quite a momentum that has been evolving in the last years in particular. However, of course, we still face some challenges to regional governance related to mobility, and also in particular related to youth mobility in the context of climate change, that are not only specific to the African context, of course, because an inconsistent legal definition of so many terminologies that are flying around in the academic debate and more so in the policy debate, of course, hampering progress in that regard. Furthermore, we also see like a rather weak interagency coordination between the policy fields and activity fields of migration, environment, and disaster risk reduction and the related authorities and organizations. And of course, there is funding fragmentation across the big spheres of development and humanitarian actors, frameworks, and the whole architectures. And finally, there's certainly always the risk of projectization rather than a long-term capacity building and the evolving of a long-term strategy when we're talking about, well, actually both human mobility as a whole, but also the interlinkages between climate change and human mobility. Well, building a continental data ecosystem, well, we have existing systems. I've partly mentioned them. IOM has DTM, the displacement tracking metrics. We have, of course, the IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, with its data system or systems. We have the FAO, we have WMO. And there are, of course, also attempts, in particular in recent years, to strengthen national statistical offices for further integration of mobility and mobility-related data in surveys and censuses. And of course, we see that there are attempts also to further develop climate mobility indicators under African Union frameworks, and the promotion of open data collaborations among research networks such as CMAN. So also in that regard, it's absolutely justified and fair to say we have seen some progress. Now, what's the role of CMAN? I think that was already indicated by Pablo. CMAN wants to be a continental convener and also a knowledge hub, and it wants to facilitate South-South research cooperation and research policy dialogue, but to some degree also South-North research and policy dialogue. CMAN definitely wants to support the integration of climate mobility and related evidence into AU and also the relevant United Nations frameworks. And definitely CMAN wants to link African researchers with the global policy processes which are relevant in that regard. The COPs, the related UNFCCC processes, the revision of NDCs, all that is something where African voices need to be more heard, and generally we need more African voices in these processes. What are the priorities for the next phase of CMAN? I think it's necessary to build a continental data sharing framework and more support efforts of data harmonization are needed. Furthermore, we also need to strengthen regional policy coherence among the regional organizations. We need to support national implementation of African Union and also IGAD, ECOWAS, SADC, etc., regional economic community level commitments. And we also need to invest further into capacity building and youth research, young researchers, networking, and preparing them for leadership roles. So just to quickly conclude, climate change and new mobility is a continental reality in Africa. And we see that regional cooperation offers not only just one pathways, but many pathways for more coherence and also for more, let's call it Pan-African, or in general for solidarity. And it's also obvious that empowering African researchers can ensure data-driven, just and inclusive policymaking when it comes to human mobility in the context of climate change. So thank you very much. And yeah, I think over to my colleague Andu Wase. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Colleagues, our final presentation this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, comes from Dr. Awundo Wase Tagba, reader and associate professor in sociology at the Federal University of Gusau in Nigeria, and a member of the CMARN steering group. Dr. Tagba is a leading scholar on climate mobility and forced migration in West Africa. He has served as a consultant and co-researcher on projects supported by Open Society Africa, the European Union, UK Aid, and UNICEF, and he is a member of the Climate Mobility Africa Academy in Kenya. His presentation, African Perspectives on Climate Mobility, Evidence, Policy, and Practice, draws on national and regional studies, including work from Nigeria, to explore how empirical evidence informs policy, how African researchers are shaping adaptation strategies, and how gaps between policy and practice can be bridged through research collaboration. Dr. Tagba, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Pablo. Like you rightly introduced, a steering group member of CMARN and an expert in climate mobility and forced migration. My colleague Benjamin has touched on most of the activities we do and how we've been working with the support from IOM to advance research and policy on climate mobility in Africa. I think I can share my slide. Yes, can you see my slide?
We can see all your individual slides if you just want to switch it to presentation.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So I'm talking on African perspectives on climate mobility, evidence, policy, and practice. Yeah. You know, Africa recently has become an epicenter of climate-related mobility. You know, principally influenced by floods due to the fact that most of the African cities are located on the coastal regions, and the impact of flooding particularly has been eminent in the continent, especially in 2002, where the continent had one of the worst flood disasters in recent years. The concern has been that the African voices are actually underrepresented in the global frameworks. And if you see the research that has been conducted, and some of the policies on climate mobility. Now we want to look at how addressing climate mobility will be context specific, with the local voices, the participation of local communities, and inclusion, to see that they co-design policies and solutions to climate change and how it affects mobility. Principally, we look at the spectrum of adaptation, migration, displacement, immobility. These are really they are interconnected, and they can only be addressed through a very holistic approach. They are the main issues of concern. How do people adapt to these sudden changes? How do they migrate? It's not just about migrating, dignified movement of people. How do they move? Where are they moving to? The people who choose not to move, who are immobile, what are the issues? Even though they know they are going to face some disasters, climate-induced disaster, they choose not to move, probably because of their attachment to the environment, probably about thinking about their future, where are they moving to, the issues of their livelihoods, and all these issues put together. So the African dynamics are shaped by the rural livelihoods, like I've mentioned, urbanization trends, demographics, and governance structure. These are, again, interconnected. People are attached to their livelihoods, they are attached to places where they make their livelihoods. But when they are forced, they are pushed to move because of these extreme events. They move to the urban areas, and then, in some informal settlement, informal settings, and then a lot of issues are coming. And looking at the governance structure, this is another issue which I will discuss much further in the presentation. There are no clear policies, clear structures to guide migration governance, especially when it comes to response, when it comes to, trying to mitigate this. Some of the policies that are there are not really implemented. And then you see some fragmentations, and then, the governance structure is not really doing what it should do to maintain the impact of climate mobility. So we also have this issue of peace, security, and development. Of course, climate is not directly linked. It's not a direct cause of insecurity and conflicts, but of course, it exacerbates these existing vulnerabilities and create room for conflicts, which I will discuss further. This has been discussed by. So we look at local realities, looking at Nigerian case study where I've conducted research in northern Nigeria on floods. We come to understand that flooding, especially in 2022, affected so many people in Nigeria, and it was one of the worst in the history of the country. And when people are displaced, there are issues. Like I mentioned, how they move, dignified movement. Where are they going to? What about their livelihoods? And then the situation in which displaced people live. It becomes really an issue of concern. And if we link this to desertification, especially in northern Nigeria, there's this issue of transhumance, the movement of, pastoral mobility, like I was maybe mentioned, and then you see that because of uh, uh, the unsafe movement of these pastoralists, they have to really come in conflict with the farmers and all of that because they trespass. And then they try to actually prove that whatever they are doing, that is their way of life, that is their way of livelihood. And in the process, they also interfere with the livelihood of farmers who also depend on crops. And this has been here for years. And it's really a complex situation that Nigeria is currently dealing with, displacing a lot of people because desertification has taken over there. There are no grasslands, in the far northern, northwest, northeastern part of the country. And this movement is yearly. They move down north central to the southern part of Nigeria, and it has been, we've been experiencing a conflict around those areas. If you look at the demographic pressures, this is one issue we are also dealing with. You see the population of Nigeria has been increasing all these years. We are talking about over 230 million people. And then you see that in some of, there is increasing competition for land, increasing competition for resources, expansion of cities, and of course, development projects. This is again also linked to conflict because there has been an argument that the farmers were, I said there were some grazing routes that were actually designated in the early 1950s, 1960s. And then they still have this feeling and this thinking that these grazing routes should be maintained. Now, demographic dynamics have changed all of that. Development has taken place in so many places that they claimed they were grazing routes and all of that. So it becomes very difficult to still maintain this pattern that was done, some decades ago. And then the government has not been clear to actually design ways to actually resolve this conflicts. To speak out about the grazing route, to adopt some kind of global practice for the for livestock rearing that is done in other countries like Mexico, like we adopt ranching and all of this. So it's really becoming a complex situation, and this has created a lot of humanitarian situation and displacement because there's no grazing land in the northern because desertification has taken over, and they have to go and graze somewhere else, and in that process, coming into conflict with farmers. Again, we have issues around disaster risk governance. It's one serious issue of concern. There are no clear, policies on issues of response, issues of disaster preparedness, mitigation and recovery. And then, the little policies that have been there are not being really implemented. Now you find situations where people refuse to adhere to warning signals to actually evacuate, even when they know that the disaster is about to happen. Because they question, there are no clear structures, governance structures, on how people should migrate, how people should move to safer places. Even in the IDP camps, they provide for IDP camps. The IDP camps are not really looking up to the way people can live healthy, with a lot of issues around health concerns, around rights, abuse, and all of that. So the governance issue is an area of course, there are policies that have been designed to do that, but the implementation of these policies have been an issue of concern. And sometimes they are only confined to government cycles. that are not really made known to the people to actually understand even their rights to have access to some of the facilities that are meant for people who have been displaced by disasters. So we look at the evidence we have here is climate mobility is multi-causal and context specific. Because my colleague Dr. Benjamin mentioned of this issue of unclear definition of what constitutes climate mobility. Experts and researchers have been trying to actually look at how can we contextualize this issue of climate mobility. But of course, in order to address the impact of climate-induced displacement, we have to look at so many factors that come into play, and we also have to be very specific. We have to look at issues around land use. We have to look at issues around response strategies, issues around livelihoods. And then every region, even in Africa, every country have its own context. So of course, we look at gender issues, age, livelihood. These are some of the demographic factors and characteristics that actually impact vulnerability and resilience. Of course, female, women and girls, and of course the younger children are more affected by this impact. We have issues around even sexual violence on women in displaced camps, and of course, because of livelihood, there's this kind of transactions around sex just to survive, to earn survivors and all of that. So these are issues that should be taken into consideration to look at vulnerability and resilience. Of course, evidence-based policymaking requires the sustenance of research networks like CIMAN, who have over the years tried to bridge these research and policy gaps, bringing researchers and policymakers to see how we can take a holistic approach in addressing climate mobility in Africa. So we also look at how we can influence policy by translating data into policy briefs and adaptation frameworks. And of course, like earlier mentioned by Pablo, that has been done. We have some, CIMAN has published some policy briefs over the years. And of course, we're looking forward to integrating it into the African Union climate strategy, to also support regional consultations, ECOWAS, West Africa, IGAD, East Africa, and then SADC, South African Development Commission. Also to contribute to cooperative processes and loss and damage. Of course, CIMAN have key messages which were presented in COP29, in COP30. We're not there. We didn't have a representative there, but we find a way to disseminate our key messages. And Notice Beniqua, we also be in COP30 to also present CIMAN's key messages. We also look at strengthening research collaborations, which I've already mentioned, CIMAN connecting researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to see how this data can translate to policies and then the implementation. to address climate mobility in Africa. Of course, promoting African-led evidence and generation and South-South learning. Of course, it will go a long way to address these climate issues if African researchers are actually promoted who actually know these issues, who have lived experience of this climate-induced displacements and all of that, and also to get their voices and inputs in global policies on climate mobility that are context specific. Of course, the Timan working groups have been working around to see how they can enhance policy dialogues, and of course, youth inclusion in the activities. So we have some recommendations. I have some recommendations here. One is to integrate mobility into all national and regional adaptation plans. This has been really an issue. When I actually carried out the study, I discovered that all the migration plans, would not really capture climate mobility, especially in Nigeria. There's no specific strategy to actually address climate mobility. They can talk about migration, they can talk about displacement, but the context specific on climate mobility is not really addressed, and that is a gap. And so as ECOWAS and then other regional bodies to actually focus on this. So I also recommend investment in African data systems to monitor climate mobility trends. Of course, like earlier mentioned, we have to encourage local researchers so that they can bring out data. We have to use a kind of a data-driven system to actually translate to policies. But first, we have to understand the trends. We have to understand the issues, and then the dynamics and the patterns of this mobility to be able to address it. And investing in African scholars will actually bring these issues from, it will be continent and country specific. It will also have the voices of the local people who will participate in co-designing solutions to climate mobility. But we also bridge research policy divides through joint knowledge protocols. Of course, we share knowledge with institutions, with organizations, and see how together we can bridge this issue of research policy, so that whatever is done, the data should not just be there, but it should be translated to policy and practice. Of course, empower local institutions and communities-led adaptation responses. Of course, if the local institutions are actually empowered, a lot will be done in this area. So conclusion, climate mobility is not only a challenge, it's an adaptation pathway, because we have to actually look at how people can actually adapt to these changes. To see how we can combine, bring a comprehensive management. How people are moving. I mean, where are they moving to? What are their expectations? How do they, take care of their livelihoods? In places where they are living. Are there issues around human rights abuse? Are there issues around children and all of that? So it is really an adaptation pathway. African researchers and policy makers are already shaping global narratives. So, a lot of research and policy frameworks are being developed, but again, this needs to be encouraged to have an inclusive system where African perspectives are also strengthened, and then there's this inclusive policy where country-specific and region-specific will take into consideration to address climate mobility in Africa. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tarba. So that brings our presentation segment to an end. Thank you very much to all three speakers for their insightful presentations. We now have approximately 30 minutes for questions and discussion. If you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can state your question. Otherwise, I'm conscious that Mark has also provided a written question in the Q&A function. So perhaps we can start there if there's no immediate questions from the audience. And I have a couple of questions from my side as well. So in the Q&A function, Mark is asking, my question for our presenters from CMARN and IOM, in light of increasing political resistance to people-positive climate and migration policy solutions in the global north, how do we leverage African knowledge and influence to recenter the conversation towards rights and opportunity? Any of the three panelists wish to jump in and go first?
Perhaps maybe I'll just start because my response is going to be very quick. I guess from IOM side, I guess what we're doing in terms of providing a platform and generating collaboration between those who are actually producing knowledge and their first-hand experiences, the effects of climate change. I think that's the role as an international organization that we should be having. So creating these partnerships, creating this network, funding these opportunities and so on. Ultimately, the conversations and knowledge will come from researchers in the global south, researchers in Africa for this particular case. So then I'll pass on the floor to my colleagues who can speak a bit more on that.
Thanks, Pablo.
Yes, maybe
Please do.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Mark, you asked a question on political resistance to people-positive climate and migration policy. If I could get him correctly, you want to see to leverage on African knowledge and influence, recenter the conversation towards rights and opportunity. During my presentation, I mentioned that the issue of climate mobility it has to be approached in the context, of Africa, in the context of regional context. The African perspective and the African situation, how rights are defined in the African context, it's not really same like in the global north. So you see that we have been struggling to actually domesticate some of these frameworks. Some of these policies that have been there are not really adhered to. They are not really implemented. So it is a big challenge. One, to even harness the local perspectives in the first place. We have been clamoring for the issue of support for research that we include the voices and also co-design these solutions by the local actors or local people who have been directly affected by this. So actually coming down to the African context, we really have to look at these governance issues first to get these frameworks. I made mention that in all the frameworks, there are no clear, mentioning or strategies to address climate mobility. Of course, they have touched around migration. They have really discussed issues around displacement. But then in the context of climate mobility, these policies are yet to address it. So we need a clear framework from the governance structures to be able to harness conversations, to be able to create opportunities on how this is done. For now, that is not done, and there is no clear pathway to which climate mobility issues will be discussed. I think that's my contribution to my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Benjamin, you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe looking at Anawaz's last slide, there was this message that mobility is not only a challenge, or mobility in the context of climate change is not only a challenge, but I mean, it can actually provide at least parts of the solution. And I think that is also something that we are all working in this whole mobility, climate change and disaster sphere should emphasize on. I mean, we still are talking about, or many people in Europe, also maybe other parts of the world, are still afraid that climate change might cause in the near future, like millions and millions of so-called climate refugees to move to Europe, North America, wherever. And I mean, in Europe, many people are afraid that there will be many Africans to do so. And we know that, I mean, this is not, let's put it like that, not an overly realistic scenario. And I think we should emphasize on that. And we should also emphasize on that, that, I mean, remittances are not just used for consumption purposes, are not only used for educational and health related issues, but I mean, meanwhile, they're also used for climate change adaptation at the local levels, for disaster risk reduction and related purposes. So, I mean, people are already using kind of migration or migration-related mechanisms for climate action. And I say climate action, that should include all that. And I think if we really try to push these kinds of narratives, it opens the spaces for what Mark has been addressing with his questions, bringing in also like the African voices in African policy centered debates, etc.
Thank you very much. So we have a second question in the Q&A function from Samson from Ghana. Samson is asking, as mentioned earlier from the Nigerian experience, that climate migration policies are usually missing in the broader migration policy domain. What is the best approach for lobbying for these broader migration policies to capture climate mobility?
Yes, I think I can address this question. Then my colleagues can also add. To something, you see, the issue is we have to engage this regional bodies like ECOWAS, the AU. I believe they have some structures that look into displacement, and it has to be at something that has to be at the policy level. So we have to bring in, also have some policy dialogues with government officials, of course, some of the agencies that are saddled with this, to see how they can really key in and revise some of these policies to include climate mobility. That is the way to go. And I believe that IOM and other organizations can also front this, bring experts together, bring also the government, agencies, and the people implementing these policies. If all of us are brought together in a way that is systemic, we can bring out these issues, and then these policies will be revised. To actually take care of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Pablo or Benjamin, you want to come in on this question as well? Or if not, I have a couple of others.
Yeah, I
Happy
think
to pass.
what I could add, I mean, directly relates also a bit to the last question. I mean, we also need to show that mobility related mechanisms, what the diaspora can bring in, can be part of the solution. And I mean, the mechanisms to boost or to foster these positive mechanisms, of course, are also pretty much in the football field of the overall migration and mobility related policies. On the other hand, I mean, directly also that directly relates also to this whole data and evidence gaps related discussions. I mean, you could always say, well, we still need more evidence, and we still have this huge debate on attribution and how far is climate change actually contributing or causing certain mobility processes. Yes, I mean, you can also take this one as an excuse just to say, well, let's wait, let's not rush to conclusions. We still need more evidence. Well, on the other hand, we still have good data systems and really good data sets, and if you all put that into one basket and apply some kind of let's say thick description approach, you still can say, well, climate change is having an impact on new mobility. Whether it's 80% in this case or just 50 in that case doesn't really matter. It's definitely a major driver in many of the geographical contexts, as we were mentioning earlier on. So let's bring it in, and let's forget about all those sensitivities that are still existing around this whole climate change and new mobility topic. That is certainly because, I mean, people just associate displacement and major displacement events to it, but there's much more to it. So yeah, that would be my 5 cents to that in a nutshell.
Thank you. Pablo?
I'm happy to pass, but I'm also conscious, Nick, that you might want to overstep your role as chair and maybe talk about the policy side on the climate mobility work that we do in IOM.
Turning the tables. I mean, I can say a few words. I'm not sure it's my place, but colleagues, thanks to Pablo, in any case, I'm the acting chief of climate in IOM. And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of solid work being done, and it's largely due to a lot of great advocacy and visibility work, as well as I think a much strengthened understanding of the impact of climate disasters, environmental degradation by member states on displacement and diverse forms of human-induced climate change related mobilities and immobility. And as a consequence of that, we have some really, I think, profound advancement in the last. So this year is the 10th year anniversary of the Nansen International Protection Agenda. Within the 10-year period, I think we've seen some real growth in terms of regional frameworks, whether it's the Kampala Declaration for Migration, Environment, and Climate Change in Africa, or the Pacific Climate Mobility Framework, for example. At least there's I think very visible demonstrations of political will and interest and engagement from member states, and certainly within the negotiations at the UNFCCC COP processes as well. Human mobility is something that has gone from being relatively minor within those discussions and considerations into something that's very much been mainstreamed. The number of events that feature human mobility during the COPs has grown exponentially in recent years, and I think that's mirrored in the negotiations track content and decision making. The new fund for responding to loss and damage is a case in point, refers to not only IOM but also to migrants and displaced populations as constituencies for consultation in terms of fund decisions. And so whether it's in reference to adaptation, where the global goal on adaptation is moving forward with new indicators, or the development of technical guides in close partnership with UNFCCC and many other entities, whether that's in relation to human mobility as a non-economic loss, or access to climate finance, or human mobility integration within national adaptation plans. I think there's been generally a lot of very positive progress within the space in terms of human mobility inclusion, and certainly consideration within policy development. As colleagues have pointed out, there's still a long ways to go in terms of data, evidence-based attribution, which is something that is likely to be, I would say, dramatically impacted by the changing financial environment, both within the humanitarian and development space, as priorities in traditional bilateral donor countries change. So yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of progress. I hope it can certainly be sustained. Anyways, stepping maybe back into my role as moderator, I have a few additional questions, and I don't see any hands up from the audience, but audience members, feel free to put up your hand. We can unmute you if you'd like to take the floor, or if you're more comfortable simply to type in a question in the Q&A function, please don't hesitate to do so. Maybe I'm wondering if I can turn to Benjamin and just ask a question about what you would see as practical first steps towards moving from what in some instances are currently fragmented national data sets to something that moves us towards the type of integrated framework which you were discussing within your presentation on climate mobility data. I'm wondering if you could basically give us an orientation as to how we might get there.
Very generally speaking, I think an important step would be that national data systems really soundly integrate and hopefully harmonize, but let's put it more generally, a mobility section into their surveys and into their censuses. Because for a long time, that has been missing. Not only, I think, as far as I can see, I'm not a data specialist per se, but I mean, as far as I can see, mobility-related sections in surveys and census data that has been missing for decades in many statistical offices worldwide, and for political reasons, for other reasons, I don't know. But I think that is definitely an important step when it comes to the national side of things. Furthermore, a more sound and streamlined hazard tagging, for instance, is also important. As I already indicated, I think there are really good data sets, data systems, surveys, panel data. It's all there. But it's really a problem to sometimes take care of interconnecting these systems, because I mean there is not a really good hazard tagging, or there is no good mobility tagging, depending now on the specific theme of a data set. So I think that would be those would be like important steps towards a better to achieve better overall data architectures.
Great, thank you so much. Aundwase, you wanted to come in?
Yes. Thank you, Nicholas. You see, we have to conceptualize climate mobility, because most of the data sets are available, you know, the context of climate mobility is actually missing. So it is not clear who, of course, some of these conflicts induce displacement are also, climate related. They are climate induced. And so the best way to go about this is to get the policymakers to actually conceptualize climate mobility, so that we should be clear on who is moving and what actually induced this movement. to clearly separate this and then know how to deal with the issues. Like I said earlier, this climate mobility is not captured in any of these strategies specifically. So you can see a large amount of data up there, but then you can't really figure people who are moving specifically due to climate change. So if this is done, it will go a long way to actually approach this issue and address it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe an additional question for you, Amdwase, but could you maybe give us some concrete steps that governments or regional organizations like SADC or IGAD could potentially take to ensure that African-led research is really working to inform national adaptation and migratory planning?
Yes, isolated voices and then, individual research could not really bring these policymakers to the table. And that was why I was mentioning IOM and other organizations who can actually champion this cause to bring these policy makers together and the government agencies. There must be a coordinating a center of coordination that can actually bring these policy makers together. Already they have some existing policies. It's just to, sit with them, have some policy discussions, and then bring them, convince them to see how they can key in this issue of climate mobility and adaptation policies in their policies. I think if this is done, there will be, it has to be a holistic approach. This is a policy level issue, and it is those who have the authority to, to legalize these policies and implement them. They are the issue here. The researchers, we have been working around the system, doing research, doing that, but that is not translating. The recommendations, I don't even know if it actually gets to them. But if there is a coordination to bring, all of us to a round table, we will be able to convince them, and they will see reasons. We will participate in the process, and then some of these policies might even be revised, and this will be accommodated. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Pablo, I wonder if I could ask about CCMD, the Climate Change and Migration Data Program. Just wondering specifically if you have any examples of one or more partner country under the initiative where you're starting to see more collaboration between researchers and the program or government partners in terms of any kind of concrete policy making that might be currently underway, or at least steps in that direction.
Unfortunately, yeah, can you hear me? Yes. I know we're halfway through the program, and it might sound a bit off to say that we're still on early stages, but as you know, producing research and then creating the dissemination stage in which you influence policy takes a little bit of time, particularly implementing such a large program and getting it ongoing. So what we're starting to see is really, really interesting outputs coming out of the data and research pillar, including very innovative products, including around the CVA, being able to implement CVA in CVA are climate vulnerability assessments. They are sort of assessments that have been pioneered by IOM, namely in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we're doing it for the first time in a number of different countries across the three regions that covered by the program, and this is something new. The program is standardizing that, so that the countries are at different stage of the implementation of the CVA, but that has already caught the attention of government counterparts. So, while we still don't necessarily have the final product, it's sort of like it's being watched. So that, for example, is one thing. Aside from that, there's a number of different research streams that are happening in different parts of the program, different countries, which are done in collaboration with researchers. So, for example, Egypt is a particular example where a number of different projects are being coming out with the AUC, the American University of Cairo, and similarly. Unfortunately, we don't have the concrete stuff, but things are being done in different places. One of the tasks of the technical leads of the program will be certainly in the 2026 year, which will be sort of the year to wrap this up, is to make a bit more of a coherent approach to see, we will be having a lot of different products coming out in different places and trying to make a thread that explains, okay, what is the goal of the I mean, what's the achievement of the program in view perhaps of continuing obviously this program into a phase 2 and so on. But so yeah, the brief answer will be not yet, but it's looking promising.
Great. Thanks, Pablo. For the audience, I included a couple of links in the chat about climate vulnerability assessments from Afghanistan, including an analysis dashboard that we maintain on a nationwide level for Afghanistan. As well, I've shared some, it's essentially the website for IOM DTM in Iraq. They have a number of climate tools, but there are some interesting reports, climate vulnerability assessments from the Kurdistan region in particular. So we certainly look forward to CVA setup and release from different contexts under CCMD as well. Colleagues, we're down to our final 3 minutes. It doesn't seem like there's any additional questions from the audience. Perhaps we could just go between the three of you, and if you have any just 30-second closing remarks, any kind of message you would like to leave the audience with, we can do it that way and then close. Adouanse, do you want to start us off?
So, thank you, Nicholas. I want to sincerely appreciate IOM, Suman, and of course, Western University Michigan, for the opportunity to actually share our thoughts and contribute in this symposium. I also appreciate my colleagues in Simon, Benjamin, and Mark, and of course Pablo of IOM for all the coordination he has put in place. Thank you very much. I look forward for further discussions so that I will also have the opportunity to contribute to bring the African perspective on board. And I will ever be available whenever I'm called upon to participate. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Benjamin, over to you.
Yeah, also a big thank you from my side to Melissa, Pablo, and also Nicholas for making this, and Aonuase as co-panelists for making this happen. I think those of us who are working in international cooperation affairs, I think we, to some degree or the other, have been facing difficult times in the last month for obvious reasons. But I think events like this also show us that things are still moving forward, that we still have windows of opportunity to discuss important issues such as mobility in the context of climate change. And we also see that there is progress and more to come. So thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the week to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pablo, final words over to you.
Sure, thanks a lot. I guess I was trying to share with colleagues on the chat a couple of links. So Melissa, if I'm not succeeding in getting it through to all the participants, so Melissa, if you can, then that would be great. So first, a thank you to the symposium organizers for inviting us, for allowing us to highlight our work, both IOMs and CMERNs. Thank you to colleagues from CMERN for making this happen. You are the subject matter experts and so on, and we're looking forward to the collaboration and producing more interesting products. And Nick, thanks to you for the excellent sharing and for making this a very enjoyable conversation. On the links that I shared, please follow the CCMD. In the CCMD page, you'll be able to request to follow for more outputs and so on. So get newsletter and so on if that's of interest to you. I'll also share a link on the research, IOM research, that we also have a newsletter if you're interested in knowing a bit more about what IOM produces as research. I also shared and a link to the publications platform, which is sort of the IOM's platform where we externally put all the work that we produce, and where we'll be highlighting the special issue that will come out between IOM and CMERN. And I also took the liberty to put the link to CMERN's website there as well. So again, thanks for everyone for attending. Yeah, it was great to have this conversation, and looking forward to having more similar events taking place.
Thanks,
Over to
Pablo.
you.
Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks to Melissa and the organizers. And thank you to the audience for your participation today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Climate Mobility Symposium. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.